I'm going to address some of the issues that I addressed in those 2 lectures at the Methodist Church. Maybe repeat a little bit of what I said there. In my first lecture there, I was talking about how to use my critical commentary. And what I'm going to talk about today is how to use critical commentaries in general, not specifically mine. Now, I think in using any critical commentary, it's important to begin by first reading the extended introduction to the commentary, because there is where you will learn the methodology, the operating assumptions, and the general approach that the author will be taking to his or her particular interpretation of the prophetic text. Now, you will sometimes find that a critical commentary is published in installments. And when that happens, the introduction usually is not finished, which means that basically if you buy one of these, you're working through the text with the author and you don't know what his assumptions are, you learn it as you go. I think from the standpoint of the reader, that's inconvenient, a lot more work, and by the time you finally get the introduction added to the commentary, you've already done all the work with the author. From the standpoint of the reader, I wouldn't buy a critical commentary coming out in installments unless I was so convinced that that particular author was the greatest author on the subject in the world, because I'd rather start with their mature thought on the book instead of figuring out as I go. I mean, let that person do the work for deciding these issues. So basically, it's far more efficient for the reader if the commentator distills his introduction and his insights in the introduction for the reader and allows the reader simply to look at that in quick fashion. Now, once one has absorbed the commentator's introductory comments, one is prepared to read the commentator's translation and detailed commentary. And if you control the biblical languages, one may want to carefully work through the text, noting and evaluating the commentator's attitude toward textual criticism, toward reasoned textual emendations, or the assumed sanctity of the Masoretic text, despite some examples of an obviously corrupt text. Now, let me just say a word about textual criticism in Old Testament studies. If you've studied mainly New Testament, you know that we have very early manuscripts of parts of the New Testament, and we have many different manuscript families for New Testament works. So that in studying a book of the New Testament, you don't have to make a lot of creative textual emendations without textual evidence, because you have early textual evidence, different families of texts that have significant differences. And you can compare those, and based on actual text, for the most part, reach some sort of reasonable conclusion about what the original text would have been. Now, that situation does not exist, for the most part, in the Old Testament. And it certainly does not exist for the book of Isaiah. Isaiah of Jerusalem, at the latest, began his ministry in 738 BC. And his ministry continued at least to 701 BC, perhaps as late as 686 BC. So, at the very least, he had a 38-year ministry. And at the longest, he had a 50-something year ministry. So he had a very long ministry from the late 8th to the early 7th century. The earliest manuscript of the book of Isaiah that we have comes from the 2nd century BC. So there is a 500-year gap between Isaiah's actual work and the first manuscript evidence we have for his work. Now, there's something like 26 or so manuscripts of Isaiah that have turned up in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other scrolls. After that, there's a gap, and it's not until the 6th century AD, mainly the 9th century AD and later, that you get other manuscripts that contain Isaiah. The problem with the Qumran scrolls is that every scroll of Isaiah that we have belongs to the same textual family. They are all Proto-Masoretic texts. So you don't have, in the case of Jeremiah, we have variant texts that are radically different. Some closer to the Septuagint, some closer to the Masoretic text. The same in Samuel. Some biblical books, we have a lot of variation in the textual evidence. Not so in Isaiah. Which means you don't have the concrete textual evidence to make judgment about the original text. Now, there's a major divide among Old Testament scholars as to what an interpreter of a biblical book like Isaiah is trying to do. My own point of view is I want to recover the actual words that the 8th century prophet Isaiah used. What did Isaiah actually say? There are other scholars, very prominent scholars, who say our job is not to interpret the real words of Isaiah, but to interpret the received text. That is, the Masoretic text. We saw this in the RSV committee when we were discussing translation of chapter 9 in Isaiah. There's a passage there that is obviously, I think, corrupt. Most commentators agree that it's corrupt. There's a clear way of correcting the text. You don't have textual evidence to do it, but there is a fairly obvious correction that a great many commentators, probably the majority of critical commentators, say, yes, this is what Isaiah originally said. Well, when the NRSV committee did the translation of Isaiah, I prepared the agenda for Isaiah, and this struck me as a no-brainer. This is obviously the correct text, and I assumed we would vote on it and it'd be no problem. There was one prominent scholar who was in the subcommittee who said, yeah, that's probably what Isaiah said, but our job is not to translate what Isaiah said, but to stick with the Masoretic text. And you can fudge the Masoretic text to make sense of it. Well, all hell broke loose in the committee. We got people were shouting at one another and throwing chalk and erasers. It was a really, and one scholar threatened to resign from the committee if we did this kind of nonsense. This went on for 30 minutes to an hour. It was really a bitter debate. And finally, the chair of our subcommittee was an old Episcopalian, a gentle old man, and he said, we're getting a little too hot. Let's take a break and go have coffee. So we went and took a break. We had coffee. We came back, and everybody was exhausted from this debate. And they decided, oh, well, let's just leave it the way it is in the Revised Standard Version. Well, the way it was in the Revised Standard Version was a translation of the corrupt text, which, and of course, when the reviews of the NRSV came out, the reviewer said, why on earth did they leave this bad translation in chapter 9? I mean, I found it so irritating. But what was worse, I knew how the committee liked to debate every little point. There was something in the next verse or two that could be discussed, and I thought, well, this would be a good time to get a discussion from the group. So I put out this harebrained suggestion that I didn't believe in even, but I thought, you know, I'd like to hear the group discuss this. Well, what happened, unfortunately, was the group said, well, Robert's lost the last one. Let's just give him this one. And they voted before I could get my mouth shut and say, wait a minute, no. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I was so shocked and so embarrassed that this horrible idea got in the text. I have completely wiped out all memory of what that suggestion was. To this day, I cannot recall the stupid idea that got into the NRSV because I lost the previous vote. So we had a bad translation and then a worse translation. Now, that's a warning in your use of translations, by the way. There is no translation that is always accurate. And a lot of stuff that gets into translations gets in because committees argue with one another. And in a committee, you learn how to argue to convince the other people on the committee. You know, if there's somebody on the committee that thinks the King James is great, you argue, well, this is like the King James. Let's go with it. I mean, it's not that you really believe the argument. It's just, you know, this argument will convince the other person on the committee. So beware of translations. Now, I would very strongly argue that our job as critical scholars is not to defend the received text, but to try to get back to the words of the prophet. And I would argue very strongly for that. Now, and I want to say this because I'm a scholar that believes that every preacher should ideally learn to read Hebrew and Greek fluently. All right, let me say that to begin with. But having said that, I think in your reading of critical commentaries, your ability to read English with a really hard-nosed, even obnoxious demand for evidence is just as important as your ability to read Greek and Hebrew. Now, I assume that all of you are accomplished English readers, and that as good critical readers, you have a sense for what kind of evidence is required to prove a claim. Unfortunately, however, I find that many critical readers lose their critical acumen when they start reading critical commentators. They assume, without real evidence, that the commentator, after all, he or she is a published scholar, someone well known, so they must know what they're talking about, even if the evidence for such confidence is sadly lacking. Now, let me illustrate this by something that you will find as a common assumption in many critical commentaries. You will find the claim that the so-called false prophets prophesied for money, while the so-called true prophets prophesied without charge, freely announcing God's genuine word. Now, this simplistic contrast can be propped up by reference to a number of proof texts from the true prophets. I mean, you look at Micah, you look at Isaiah, they do talk about false prophets doing it because they get paid to do it. And you can find the same thing in Jeremiah as well. One should note, however, that all these proof texts are found in very polemical context. Now, one should ask oneself, how reliable are polemical contexts for determining what either side in the polemical debate actually did, said, or believed? One need only look at the current political debates, continuing after the election even, to see how often either side in a polemical context misrepresents the actual views of the opponents. But a polemical context is not the best way to find precisely what the opponent was saying. Even in the New Testament, if you read what Paul says about his Judaizing opponents, one still has to raise the question, is Paul's portrayal of their views really the way they would portray their own views? I mean, there's always that element of slanting the views of the others to make it easier to reject their views. And that raises then the important question: what real substantive evidence do we actually have about the real source of livelihood of any of the prophetic figures, true or false? We know that many prophets normally receive some payment for their prophetic activity. I mean, we have examples outside of polemical context. The early one is when Saul is looking for his lost donkeys, and his servant says, well, there's a seer over the hill who can tell you where your lost animals are. And Saul says, well, I don't have any money. And the servant said, I've got some, enough to pay him. This is fairly common in Israel and all the surrounding cultures that had prophetic figures. So we do know that payment for prophetic activity was fairly common. But whether all prophetic figures took payment for their prophetic activity, and whether all those who did receive payment received enough to live on this remains unclear. When it comes to Isaiah of Jerusalem, we simply do not know the source of his income. He appears to be a relatively sophisticated member of Jerusalem's elite. He seems to have been educated in the same wisdom circles as the courtiers in the royal court with whom he was in constant argument. But we don't know the source of his elitism. Perhaps he comes from a very wealthy family. Maybe he inherited money and property like Jeremiah did, but we simply don't know. Maybe he had a good paying prophetic job in the Jerusalem temple. He's often in the temple. He has a vision apparently in the Holy of Holies because he sees the Ark of the Covenant and the throne of God. So he certainly has connections with the temple. But whether it was a paying job, we don't know. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge what we do not know, and to refuse to accept glib claims to knowledge unless the person making that claim provides real evidence to back those claims up. I mean, there is so much claimed in the literature for which very little evidence exists. Now, another claim that one often finds in critical commentaries is that a particular statement you find in a prophet like Isaiah, particularly a statement that seems to conflict with the larger context in which it is found, is to be explained as a later gloss by a redactor with a particular theological agenda of this redactor who lives usually sometimes in the exilic period. Now, never mind that the assumed theological agenda is simply created out of the statement to be interpreted. That is, you find the statement, you interpret it, and then the exilic period is a convenient black hole in which to dump such ad hoc interpretations. It's not that you actually have any knowledge of either this assumed redactor or of this particular period in which this theological concern was so great. Basically, you're making the whole thing up. Now, even if the claim were true, there'd be no way to prove it. So what does one gain by making such unprovable assumptions? That is, it seems to me, as a reader, one ought to say, where's the proof for any of this? Why should I invest any interest in something that is simply unprovable, for which there is no real evidence? Now, one of the things that I do in my commentary, which is quite different than you'll find in any other commentary, I observe that Isaiah had a very long ministry. At the shortest, 38 years, the longest, 50-something years. Anyone who has preached for 38 years knows that most preachers will revisit old sermons in the later period. And even the purists who would never deign to reuse an old sermon will still reuse old themes. And you can't get away from your language that you like to use. I mean, the same phrases will reappear in later periods in your ministry or your professorship or what have you. Which raises the question, the typical approach in commentaries is to suggest if you have a conflict between the wording of a text and another statement in the text, it can't be by the same author, it must be some later person who misunderstood the author. But what if Isaiah himself, in the later period of his ministry, finds a significant analogy between the later situation and the earlier situation that he addressed early in his ministry? Good example. We have a whole series of oracles of Isaiah dated to the Syro-Ephraimitic War. In the Syro-Ephraimitic War from 735 to 732, North Israel, led by the Arameans of Damascus, formed a coalition. They wanted Judea to join in their anti-Assyrian revolt. But Ahaz was a loyal, he didn't want to join. And so they decided to remove Ahaz from the throne of Judah and put someone else on the throne of Judah so that Judah would join their coalition. And they were willing to attack Jerusalem, cut it off from its southern forces, breach the city walls, and remove Ahaz in order to get Judah to join them. All this is spelled out in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. Now, Isaiah has a number of oracles from this period. Chapter 9, chapter 8, those three children with weird names that all appear during this period. And all of these children function in oracles to reassure Ahaz, don't be afraid of the Arameans of Damascus and the Israelites of North Israel, because God is going to erase their plans. They won't succeed. Read the first part of chapter 9, you'll see this very clearly. So this is clearly what in those years Isaiah was concerned with. Now, these two, Damascus and Israel, made a surprise attack on Jerusalem, and they reached the walls of Jerusalem, but they weren't able to stay long enough to capture the city, and so they had to retreat. Now, an analogous situation occurs later on when the Assyrians are attacking Jerusalem. And what would prevent Isaiah from seeing an analogy between the threat of North Israel and Damascus in their attack on Jerusalem and the later Assyrian threat to Jerusalem? This would make a good analogy for the threat coming in the later period, so that the possibility that Isaiah himself picked up earlier oracles of his, slightly edited them to address the new situation, is just as likely as that some late author simply screwed up and put a lot of stuff in that doesn't make sense anymore. Now, and I can, if we have time, I'll look at a couple of passages in that connection. But I want to address certain other things that you will find in modern critical commentators that I find really odd. There is a kind of unbridled, unjustified arrogance in a number of critical commentators that I think is shocking. And let me illustrate this by looking at Isaiah 11:13. In Isaiah 11:13, the text reads, "And the jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and the harassers of Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim." Now, the second expression in the first half of the verse is by itself ambiguous. What does the harassers of Judah mean? It can be read as an objective genitive, those who harass Judah. Or it can be read as a subjective genitive, the harassers who come from Judah. Now, the ambiguity is resolved in the parallelism in the text, since they clearly explain Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim. So the end of the verse clears up this poetic ambiguity. And by the way, this kind of ambiguity fits the period of the Syro-Ephraimitic War, because in the Syro-Ephraimitic War there was conflict between Ephraim and Judah. Ephraim was involved with the Syrians or the Arameans in attacking Jerusalem, but once that failed and the Assyrians came against the northern kingdom, Ahaz, as an Assyrian vassal, undoubtedly participated in the war against the north. And one of the things that he surely did was to expand his northern border at the expense of Ephraim. And in fact, in Hosea, in chapter 5, verse 10, the princes of Judah are described as those who move boundary markers. This coming from a northern prophet who doesn't like what the Judeans did. So the language in this passage actually fits the context of the Syro-Ephraimitic War, and it's saying in the future this enmity between the north and the south will no longer exist. Ephraim's not going to be jealous of Judah, and Judah is not going to harass Ephraim. I mean, grammatically there's no problem with the text. Historically there's no problem with the text. But modern European scholars say, well, that can't be what the Hebrew means. We have to read it another way. And so they clip out the end of the passage. Now, I would suggest that a claim coming from a 20th century European scholar for whom Hebrew is an acquired language over against a native speaker of Hebrew, even if it's a late speaker of Hebrew, is the height of arrogance. I will not accept the commentator making a claim like that. I don't care how famous the commentator is. This just doesn't make sense. One of the things you find as you read Isaiah is that Isaiah is not only a prophet, he's a poet. And poets love to play with ambiguity. Now, scholars don't like ambiguity. And so anytime you get ambiguity, which is the plaything of poets, scholars just bend over backwards to try to get rid of the ambiguity. Can't have that. But Isaiah is a master of double entendre, triple entendre, and the more ambiguous and sneaky he can be, the better he likes it. Let me give you another example of this. In Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11, Isaiah opens an oracle against people who drink too much with the particle hoi, hey. It's a way of getting the attention of his hearers. And then he characterizes his audience with a plural participle and a following designation of time. You who get up early in the morning. And then this is followed by a designation of an alcoholic beverage and a plural verb. Hey, you or they who get up early in the morning, that beer they might pursue. That's the first line in the couplet. The second parallel line omits the particle hoi, but otherwise the structure appears to be identical. A plural participle, the following designation of time, you or they who tarry late in the evening, and this is followed again by a designation of an alcoholic beverage and a parallel verb form. So one expects it to say that wine they may chase. But only when you reach the very last syllable in the line do you discover that you don't have a plural verb, you have a singular verb with a plural suffix, completely flipping the sense of the passage. Instead of you who tarry late in the evening in order to chase wine, it's you who tarry late in the evening until wine chases them or chases you. That is, there is that flip. Well, you wouldn't believe how many competent scholars emend away this very clever shift. They insist that it has to be corrected so that you get what the reader sort of expected. But that's the whole point of subverting expectations and to show that you begin by chasing after wine, but in the end, you've lost control to the thing that you pursued. I mean, the poetry and the ethical meaning of the passage, I mean, it's clear that the poetic form is a much better reading than this pedantic, dry, scholarly approach to things. In my opinion, this is modern pedantry at its very non-poetic worst. I'm going to just mention two other things, and then I'll stop and give you a chance to ask questions, unless I get cut off. I mean,
10 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay.
We'll make it 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll leave us 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, I want to do just one name. If you go back to Isaiah 7 and 8, you have these 3 children with symbolic names. And children with symbolic names are a typical prophetic thing. You see it in Hosea where he names his children these terrible names. The last one is not my people. I mean, imagine naming your son little bastard, which is the implication of it. So, I mean, it's shocking. Now, the reason for giving symbolic names to your prophetic children is in order to shock. I mean, it's public theater. You want the audience to raise the question, what does it mean? Now, for that to work, you have to explain the name while the audience is still interested. if the child appears with that name and you don't say what it means for a year or two, by then nobody cares. It's no longer news. So you expect the name to be explained when it's given. And in the case of the third child, Mahershala Hushbaz, the explanation comes right after the name of the child is named in chapter 8, verse 3 and 8, verse 4. But in the case of the first two children, She'ar Yeshuv and Emmanuel, the name is not explained there, which is odd. What's going on? Why is there a delay in the explanation of the name? Well, we'll look at only one. We'll look at She'ar Yeshuv. Interestingly enough, this name is explained, not in chapter 7, but in chapter 10, verses 20 through 24a. In this passage, it's in an oracle which is now against Assyria. But there are traces of the oracle that seem not to fit the Assyrian period. It begins, note particularly verses 20 and following, the text begins with a promise that the remnant, She'ar, of Israel, and the survivors of the house of Jacob. Now, the house of Jacob in Isaiah normally refers to the northern kingdom. The survivors of the house of Jacob will no longer lean on the one who smote him, but will lean on the Holy One of Israel in truth. Now, the one who smote Israel and the house of Jacob was the Arameans. Rezin of Damascus had attacked Israel. If you read chapter 9, verses 7 and following, you get a whole chapter about the Aramean predations on Israel. So the one who smote Israel was clearly the Arameans, and the reference implies that the northern kingdom was trusting Rezin of Damascus, their oppressor, rather than relying on Yahweh, the imperial God of all Israel, who resides in Jerusalem. The text then continues in 10:21 with the claim that only a remnant will return, She'ar Yeshuv. There's our child's name, exactly as you have earlier on. A remnant, a She'ar of Jacob, to mighty God, El Gabor. Now, mighty God is one of the throne names given to the Judean king Hezekiah in his coronation ritual in chapter 9, verse 5, which suggests then that only a remnant of the northern kingdom will survive to swear allegiance to the Judean monarch chosen and appointed by God. Then in verses 22 through 23, you have a direct address to Israel. And you have this, even, and this is in quotes, even if your people, O Israel, notice the pronoun, even if your people, O Israel, were as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of it will return, She'ar Yeshuv. There's our child's name again. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. For the Lord Yahweh of hosts is about to make a decreed destruction in the midst of the whole land, unquote. Now, continuing this direct address in verse 24a, right after the statement, we find the statement, therefore thus says the Lord, Yahweh of hosts, do not fear, O my people. Notice, your people Israel. And then we have the contrast, my people who live in Zion. Zion is another name for Jerusalem, the capital of the Judean kingdom. And so there's the contrast between the northern kingdom, your people, O Israel, and my people who live in Zion. And then you expect it to say, do not fear, O my people who live in Zion, for I will protect you from the Arameans and the Ephraimites. But instead, it says, "O my people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of Assyria." So it is no longer put with the setting in the Syro-Ephraimitic period, where it's clearly where it originally belonged, the contrast between north and south, the contrast with the proper name Sha'ar Yeshuv, the contrast between your people Israel, my people who live in Zion. All that suggests this is originally Isaiah's words in the Syro-Ephraimitic period. But the switch at the end suggests, I think, that Isaiah himself has updated this to make it fit the period of the Assyrian threat, so that he has reapplied this. But there are traces in it that tells you that's not the original setting. And the other alternative is to simply dismiss all of this material as late gibberish, which is what you will find in most of the critical commentators. Now, let me stop there. I think I've gone far enough. And we have a few minutes for questions.
Characterizes the spiritual ethos of pagan antiquity as, quote, a kind of glorious sadness.